Thank you, George.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. The title is slightly different, and the focus is, I think, different as well. I was asked to focus mainly on smart cities, but I'm going to put in a broader context, and therefore talk about the issues of funding that are planned for the future. I hope they are useful. Obviously, I could spend a lot of time. I will leave the sanitized version of the presentation. One caveat is, as you all know, the commission is not yet, the new commission is not yet in place, and therefore many of these things are indicative both in terms of priority, but mainly in terms of the funding that will be available. Nevertheless, the funding estimates are quite meaningful, okay, because these areas are considered important and politically essential for the future. So I don't need to tell you that 5G will have a critical impact in smart cities, in cities in general. This was emphasized already by the previous speakers, but I refer to a recent study by O2, Telefonica, that measures exactly the value added of 5G for smart cities. So I just give this as an indicator. But I would like to go back to the 5G action plan, which has already a few years. And in the 5G action plan, there was a clear mandate, in the sense that this was also approved by the Council, that in each member state there should be at least one city that would be covered by 2020. Many member states have already provided, indicated their 5G smart cities. In some cases, many of them, 5 in Italy as an example, but and not necessarily capitals. And I think this is important. And the case of Aveiro is particularly interesting because certainly not the capital, but it's a very technology-oriented city. But smart cities exist in a broader context, as I implied before. There's an ample web of conurbations and transport connections that need to be taken into consideration. And beyond this, there's the whole idea of ports and associated logistic areas. And this gives you an idea of the flow of not only of traffic, but also of cargo and, as I said, logistics that across Europe. And all of this needs to be taken into consideration. The 5G action plan in this context also mandated the coverage of all major transport paths by 2025, okay? And when we talk about major transport paths, we are not just talking about road transport, okay? In the end, it's also trains, but it's also waterways, and eventually we are going to cover as well at least the coastal navigation aspects. So this is a broad area of impact. Already in 2020, we are funding a few cross-border corridors. We have already 4 being funded, and we are now launching a call that the deadline is in November for additional 3, one of which will be a rail network, okay? 2 additional road cross-border corridors, but there will be 1 train cross-border corridor. But the 5G action plan is more detailed than this. I put there all the actions that are included. Obviously, they were streamlined a bit. But what is important is that because this was approved by the member states, we are now monitoring the implementation, okay? And it was already mentioned, the 5G Observatory allows us to track the 5G developments in the member states, but also provides a context in terms of deployment outside the EU. Please go there to see if you are interested, namely what is the status in Portugal. I don't want to enter into details at this moment. But 5G, again, is not only this broad context of covering both cities and major transport paths, but it's also part of the broadband priority of the Commission. 5G requires broadband. In fact, 5G requires pervasive fiber, okay? Without it, we will not be able to cover at least the major transport paths, and namely the cross-border corridors in the future. And in order to do this, in order to promote broadband, the Commission launched, with the support of the Council and the Parliament, the Connecting Europe Facility, which is an instrument that allows funding and coordination, but also funding towards this gigabit society. In the next framework program, when things are decided, there will be a new version of the CEF. It will be called CEF 2 for simplification. And there we identify the drivers for this broadband / 5G deployment, for the acceleration of this deployment. And these are providing support to socioeconomic drivers, okay? And they are identified in terms of schools and hospitals everywhere, but also households. So, what bandwidth do these, let me go back, these socioeconomic drivers, what bandwidth do they need? There were a number of studies, and to come to the point, as I mentioned before, the requirements for the advanced services that we need to be provided across Europe, they require point-to-point fiber connections. And this is the main point of contention in terms of the funding that will be required. Just to give you an idea of what is the underlying principle is that obviously the Commission and the Member States should not fund anything where the market can resolve and take the initiative. So the whole issue of market failure, or mild market failure as we call it, will then be the only way to bring the funding into place. But to give you one idea why this investment is necessary, this is the current status of connectivity for schools and hospitals. And the darker, the better. And strangely enough, okay, you have Portugal, Spain, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, but then you have failure in France, and they are there, some regions of Germany, and Poland and Greece, okay? For different reasons. This is just an analysis of the actual status of connectivity for schools and hospitals in Europe, across the Union, okay? What bandwidth will the households need? It was already mentioned, the issue of the universities, but in general, people have more and more devices and want more and more data rates, higher and higher data rates, more and more services, broadband, and the data rates that will be required are again such that they require fiber as well. Now, in the cities, fiber will be there, but in rural areas, this is not necessarily the case. Again, to give you an example of where we are, again, the darker the better, and now you have, again, Portugal, Spain, but now the UK, Ireland, Germany, Italy, all very well covered, Scandinavia as well. less things because of the sparsely population in some areas of Finland and Sweden. But then this is for NGA, but for FTTP and DOCSIS, the coverage is not as good, okay? So there are areas where there needs to be this investment just to provide service to the households, okay? It's not only for the drivers, the socioeconomic drivers. It's for the households, just for the households, there needs to be a huge investment in fiber. I mentioned this issue of market failure. And the market failure for the different NUTS 3 zones that divide the different regions in Europe in terms of their economic development give this indication. And again, there you see that from the supply side, there are not problems again in Eastern Europe, Portugal, Spain, UK, Ireland, and even in the Baltic, Germany, there are not many problems. But there are issues, again, in the case of Scandinavia, that have to do with the sparse population that is involved. But it's not only the supply side, it's the economic, the affordability issue. And that is more or less the opposite. Portugal, Spain, Greece, Eastern Europe, and even parts of the UK have the cost of the services is too high in terms of the regional GDP. So there are issues that need to be understood. But allow me to go back. The fact that these areas are either good or bad hides a lot of details, because even in an area that is very, very good, there are holes of coverage. There are areas that are not really as good in the middle of good areas of coverage. So this might give you an idea, but you already can see there are some white spots in the middle of these coverages. Now, one aspect of providing broadband is that broadband is an enabler, namely of Wi-Fi, okay? And this gives you an idea of the public deployment of Wi-Fi in Europe. Not all the countries, but there is a huge investment in terms of public Wi-Fi hotspots, in terms of projection from 17 to 22. But still, there are countries that really need these additional Wi-Fi deployments. Who is deploying them? You have the MNOs, the cable companies, the OTTs, mainly doing this type of thing. So there is a lot of competition for the Wi-Fi networks. The issue is that because this was recognized as a problem, the Commission launched in the context of the CEF. How many minutes do I have? Launched in the context of the CEF, and I will leave this for you so you don't have to worry about this. The Commission launched the Wi-Fi for EU voucher program, okay? Where entities, namely municipalities, could ask for some money to deploy a public Wi-Fi network. Now, honestly, this is not a lot of money. Okay, these vouchers are 15 kilo euros. Okay, this is not really a considerable amount of money, but still, as you can see here at the bottom, countries like Bulgaria, Croatia, Ireland, Lithuania, Portugal, and Slovenia have more than 50% of their municipalities that won these vouchers. What they did with them, it's not that clear, okay? In the sense that we don't know for how long these networks will be available to the public, okay? And in the next framework, we want to expand this in terms of 5G deployment. So, especially thinking in terms of small cells, small 5G cells, again, we would like to fund I hope with more money than the 15K, small cell deployment of 5G in these regions where, again, there is some market failure. We are not going to cover Lisbon and Porto, not even Aveiro itself, but we would like to cover smaller villages and rural areas where otherwise no one is going to deploy in the first years, or even ever, small 5G cells, okay? And there will be, therefore, a 5G for EU funding initiative, vouchers, that will help this type of deployment, okay? So the concern to ensure that the broadband capability will be taken even to rural areas and much earlier than the market would do by itself is one of the main priorities. As I said, this is not yet ratified by the new Commission. We hope that what might change is some details, and namely the amount of the funding, but this program will certainly be available for the foreseeable future. Thank you. Okay.